Welcome back to Face the Nation. We also spoke with former Vice President Pence about the former president's entrance into the 24 presidential campaign and the prospects for his own run.
I look forward to being involved in the process in some way. You know, whether we are in the debate as a candidate or in the debate simply as an active Republican. I look forward to getting behind the Republican cause and supporting candidates around the country as well as our nominee to get this country turned back to the policies that'll make us strong and prosperous again.
That sounds like you'd prefer he's not the nominee, but you didn't say no.
Well, I just think there'll be better choices.
Mm-hmm.
I think now calls for a different time. I think the American people will want to see us move forward.
You talk about moving forward. The idea of relitigating the 2020 election continues to circulate, as you know that, amongst members of your party. Do you think that continuing to push these claims, as the former president does, is a direct threat?
The 2020 election was not stolen. We have a process in this country where states conduct elections. Questions of irregularities or fraud are then adjudicated in the courts. The states then certify electoral votes, and as we did on January 6th. But I do think there's been far too much talk questioning the integrity of our elections.
According to a CBS tally, there are going to be 156 members of Congress that will be sworn in January who continue to raise questions about the validity of the 2020 election. That's more than back in 2020. Isn't that a risk? Doesn't the party need to stop that?
There's a First Amendment in this country that people can hold the opinions that they hold, even if I disagree with them. But I have every confidence that the new Republican leadership in the Congress, the new Republican majority, when Nancy Pelosi hands the gavel to Kevin McCarthy, is going to draw the lessons from the midterm campaign, which, for me, give evidence of the fact that that the American people want the Republican Party, and frankly, all of our leaders, to be focused on the future.
Mm-hmm. Did it surprise you then that Republicans didn't end up with a larger margin?
I was surprised. I was disappointed at the outcome of the election. As you look around what happened on Election Day, candidates that were focused on the future, candidates that were focused on the issues that the American people are focused on, did quite well.
You're very proud of the Supreme Court justices put on the court who just recently struck down Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the decision on abortion access should stay in the states, or should there be a national law banning it?
From very early on in my public career, I was determined to be a champion for life. I just always purposed to advance the sanctity of life. And I always believed that Roe v. Wade would be sent to the ash heap of history. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that Ruth Bader Ginsburg even said, it was one of the great Supreme Court justices of our time.
Well, she questioned the legal basis.
She questioned the legal foundation of it, and she was right. But
does what you're talking about, the moral imperative,
yes,
does that trump states' rights?
Well, the Dobbs decision really gave the country a new beginning for life. And it did return the question of abortion to the states and the American people. Many alarmists on the American left in the beginning spoke about it banning abortion and taking away the right. And actually, I think most Americans figured out pretty quickly that, in fact, this question that bears so deeply on the life of the nation had simply been returned to the people and their elected representatives. For my part, I will tell you that I will always support efforts to strengthen protections for the unborn. I think it's most likely that it will be resolved at the state level, but the 15-week legislation in the Congress, had I been a member of Congress, I would have supported, because I think it actually—
That's not too liberal for you, because it would allow access up to 15 weeks of pregnancy.
Well,
that's where the majority of abortions are performed.
I would have supported it as a beginning.
The Rubio-Graham bill, the 15 weeks you're talking about, also has exceptions for life of the mother after the 15 weeks.
I supported those exceptions during my public career. But, Margaret, I do believe it's more likely this is going to be resolved at the state level. It may take as long to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law in all 50 states, as it did to overturn Roe versus Wade. But people that know me and my family know that so long as we live, we'll seek to be about the business of life in this country and doing our part to support the sanctity of life.
I was interested to read that you and your wife, Karen, underwent IVF therapy, which is a lot to go through. And there are people who are concerned that if you start with abortion access restrictions, that it will also lead to restrictions on IVF treatment. If you believe life begins at conception, you can make that argument. Should it be protected as a right?
Karen and I struggled for more than 5 years with unexplained infertility. And in fact, I'll never forget the day that I called home, driving off to a work appointment, and Karen answered the phone and said, "Happy Father's Day." And our son would come along, then a daughter, then another daughter, all within 3 years. And we were busy but joyful. But in the midst of all of that, we also received word that we had made the list for an adoption for a young woman with an unexpected pregnancy. But we wanted to find out if the second family on the list was clinically infertile. And when we did, we stepped aside, not wanting to prevent them from having the joy of a little one in their home. But I fully support fertility treatments, and I think they deserve the protection of the law.
What about same-sex marriage? A number of Republicans are getting on board federal protections for it. Do you believe that you need to consider that when you talk about compassion?
Well, as a Bible-believing Christian, I'll always hold the view that marriage is between one man and one woman. I think it was ordained by God, and that'll always be my values. But the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled on this in the Obergefell case. And
so you don't think a federal law is needed, like a number of Republicans
We can
are now?
disagree with Supreme Court decisions, but we can't disobey them. I respect the pronouncements of the court. And I actually think it's just as important as we go forward as a nation that we make it clear that we don't believe in discrimination against anyone because of who they are, who they love, or what they believe. But at the same time, I think we need to make sure that we protect the religious freedom of every American that's enshrined in the Constitution, the ability to live, to work, to worship in a manner according to the dictates of your conscience.
Our full interview can be seen on our website at facethenation.com and on our YouTube page. We'll be right back. This weekend, there is uncertainty about Twitter's future under its new owner, Elon Musk. For more, we are joined by tech journalist Kara Swisher, host of On with Kara Swisher, and from London, Scott Galloway, who is her co-host on the podcast Pivot and also a professor at NYU. It's good to have you both here. Big weekend. Yes. Last night, Elon Musk, Kara, put Donald Trump, the former president, back on Twitter. Yeah. He had been suspended after January 6th.
Permanently.
He went and he founded his own social media company, Truth Social. And according to filings, he has a 6-hour exclusive. He can only post there, not on Twitter.
Yeah.
So what does lifting the ban on his use of Twitter actually do?
Nothing. I mean, he's been posting, people have been posting his truths, I think that's what they're called, on Twitter already, and it gets out anyway. So he has, he's got these contractual obligations to this company that is not doing great. And I think he can't resist, and he'll probably go full Twitter at some point. But I don't think it makes any difference. Plus, he's the former president, so it doesn't hit quite as hard. So I think the juice is a little bit out of his power on that platform. We'll see.
Well, he's also, Scott, a presidential candidate, as we learned just a few days ago. He was kicked off of Facebook, Instagram, YouTube after January 6th. Do you think this opens the floodgates, or is this just a gimmick by Elon Musk for PR?
I think it's mostly the latter. I think if Elon's out of the news for more than 48 hours, he'll decide to kick him off again. He said that the people had spoken in Latin. I found that this poll, Elon Musk polls on Twitter are more for support than illumination. He ran a similar poll to see whether or not he should sell Tesla stock, and it ended up he'd already filed to sell those shares. So I think these polls are mostly a gimmick, and I would argue the people haven't spoken. The GRU has spoken. Twitter has
Russian
become
intelligence, you mean?
100%. Twitter has become a playground for bad actors and fake bots. This poll is meaningless. This decision is meaningless.
But you had predicted earlier that Twitter could collapse. We've seen thousands of employees either get fired or walk off the job. Do you stand by that?
Well, Twitter will survive, and even if it doesn't, let's keep in mind, it's not a national treasure. We would all be just fine if Twitter went away. But I think when you see this sort of wholesale firing and the way in which he's gone about firing that creates this type of resentment, I easily see the site going down. I think we should do a head of lettuce test versus when the site goes down. What we're not talking about is the knock-on effects at Tesla. You know, when you buy a Tesla, you're buying a pair of Air Jordans. You're associating directly with an individual, and no individual, maybe with the exception of Trump or Putin, has eroded more of their goodwill and brand equity than Elon Musk. And then you go to SpaceX, where everyone who works for the government, and this is a government contractor, has a responsibility determination form they have to fill out. And I think he's antagonized enough officials that we're going to start seeing more scrutiny on SpaceX contracts.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there was already talk for national security purposes to review that because of foreign ownership. Kara, for users at home, what does this actually mean? Like, what should we do to protect ourselves? Is there anything to protect ourselves against?
Collapsing. Twitter used to go down all the time with the fail whale. It was very common. And you're going to see more of that. I'm already seeing issues on the platform because of fewer people. And that's like you can't download your archive very easily. If you sign off and you have two-factor authentication, good luck getting on and stuff like that. You're going to see around the edges. There may be, the problem is if he starts pushing out big changes, you're going to see problems. If he starts doing lots of things, you're going to see problems. If one coder makes a mistake, you could see problems. And that's what it is. What everyone's going to do, Margaret, I know it's hard for us media people and politicians to understand, but it's not very big anywhere else. It's a very small service compared to the Facebooks, the Instagrams, and the TikToks of the world. And so I think it's not going to matter to most people. It's going to matter to the chattering class who enjoys dunking on each other throughout the day, essentially.
Well, I mean, it has become, in some ways, a newswire almost for government announcements, things like that.
Yeah.
Scott, I also want to ask you about this stunning fall we saw this week of the founder of FTX, this cryptocurrency exchange, 30-year-old billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, top Democratic donor. He's known in this town. Justice Department, SEC, CFTC are all now investigating. What exactly happened here?
Well, on a very broad level, we don't, as a species, we can't help but to worship people. And in the U.S., we've decided to worship tech billionaires. And they don't fall under the same scrutiny, including a 30-year-old MIT graduate who we're all hoping is kind of the next Jesus and doesn't need a board of directors or doesn't need any sort of regulatory scrutiny. And as a result, in about 24 hours, you had the immolation of $34 billion in capital. And that is literally take a medium-sized city, and everyone in that city on Tuesday has $10,000, and the next day they have zero. So this will bring in warranted scrutiny. It's more spectacle than significant because the entire crypto market now is $800 billion, and Amazon has shed over $1 trillion. And when the whole FTX debacle was unwinding, the markets were actually up. So it makes for interesting news. And unlike the great financial recession where we saw huge damage to the economy and no one go to jail, I think this is going to be the opposite. I don't think it's going to have a very big impact on the economy, but I think you're going to see some perp walks here.
Some arrests. I mean, the Treasury Secretary was asked by our Nancy Cordes about this, and she said the absence of appropriate supervision and regulation of digital assets contributed to the collapse. I mean, that's saying essentially we were asleep at the wheel as the U.S. government.
This is early, and they haven't done much regulation on the regular internet, and that's 20 years hence, essentially. And so they were just starting to come up with ideas between the SEC and the CTFC of how to regulate all this stuff. And Bankman-Fried was part of it. He was consulted quite a bit, and a lot of people were. And he was calling for regulation, if you recall, which was somewhat ironic. But they hadn't figured out how to deal with this very new and sort of explosive new financial instrument. And I think that's more the problem, is Washington moves at a glacial pace around these things. They were moving faster than they have in other areas, but they certainly hadn't figured it out. But ultimately, this is going to be, some sort of fraud case or something like that. And I agree with Scott. Someone's going to jail.
Scott, there are also layoffs, not just at Twitter, but we saw some at Facebook. We saw job cuts at Amazon. You've called this a Patagonia vest recession. What does that mean exactly?
Well, most recessions are either labeled white or blue collar, meaning that they typically impact one cohort more than the other, either executives, white collar, or blue collar, sort of the working class. This is the Patagonia vest recession, and that is we're going to see more people laid off in the growthy part of our economy that has sort of been the gift that keeps on giving for 13 years. But again, Margaret, I think this is more noise than news, because 99.99% of the people on the planet would pray to be a recently laid off person from Meta or Google. If you've been recently laid off from one of these firms, it means that you probably went to an elite school, you live in a city where the growth prospects or the economy is growing like crazy, and your biggest problem is not going to be what to do, but what not to do. So sort of
what if you're an H-1B visa recipient and you get sent back home suddenly?
Point.
Fair point. I mean, you saw
That's
that
a fair
picture.
point.
You saw that picture from Twitter. I mean, Elon put another performative photo up of them doing coding. I'm not sure what they were doing, but there were people there that were clearly from other countries, and so they are stuck there. They can't leave, and I think that's one of the issues you're going to have for all these people is where do they go? A lot of companies are taking care of it. I think Facebook was one of them, or Meta was doing that. So they'll try to figure that out, but Scott's 100% right. These are people who have lots of options, and there will be more jobs for them comparatively. And I will note that Scott does himself have a Patagonia vest, and he's doing just fine. So.
Never.
Yes, you do.
Never.
I've seen it.
All right, next time you got to wear it, Scott. Thank you. Good to see you. Scott's joining us there from London. And Kara,
Thank you.
Good to have you here in studio. We'll be back with the mayor-elect of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. We go now to Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass, who made history last week when she became the first woman and the first black woman to be elected mayor of Los Angeles. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You are going to be sworn in as mayor of LA December the 12th. You've got a lot of work cut out for you, and I know you campaigned hard on the. You did. You campaigned hard on the issue of crime and homelessness, and I want to get right into that. Homicides up 14% from 2 years ago. Robberies up almost 16% in LA over that same time. Do you plan to keep the current police chief?
Yes, there's no desire on my part to remove the current police chief. You know, we have a crisis in our city with homelessness as well. 40,000 people are asleep in tents all throughout our city, and 4 or 5 of them pass away every morning. And so we have multiple crises right now, and so it's my intent on day one to address that issue, and it's my understanding that the chief of police's contract is up at the end of next year.
So you could revisit it at that time, in other words.
Right, revisit that along with many other general managers as well.
Yeah. When I ask about your approach to policing, I'm mindful that you're in a pretty unique position because you worked on this in Congress in putting forward the George Floyd Policing Act. In your public safety plan for LA, you talk about hiring more officers. And I know in the past you've said that defund the police was one of the worst slogans ever. How do you bring all that to changing policing in LA? What specifically do you do that's different?
Well, first of all, I think what's most important about police reform, whether we're talking in Los Angeles or any place else, is accountability and transparency. Those are 2 things that are critical. In terms of hiring police officers, we've had several hundred police officers retire or move on for other reasons. And what I am proposing is that we replace the ones that the city has allotted for. In other words, bringing the police department up to its full force that is budgeted. The other thing is that in many communities, they want to see an increased police presence. And so I am calling for moving officers off of administrative duty and putting them on the streets. That's the way we can hire them as soon as possible. But in addition to that, I believe in obviously stopping crime when it occurs, but doubling down and tripling down in communities where crime prevention strategies and different approaches are required. And I've worked on this for a number of years. And so I want to fully fund programs to prevent crime, to intervene, especially with young people. And one of the things that our current chief of police said is that he accounted for a spike in crime, especially post restrictions of the pandemic, because many of the crime prevention programs shut down due to COVID.
You disclosed back in September that you yourself were a victim of burglary at your home, and you had 2 guns stolen at that time. And I wonder, did you have those guns because you felt unsafe in your own home? And did you go out and purchase new weapons?
I have not purchased new weapons. I had 2 handguns. I had owned them for a very, very, very long time. And I certainly believe in an individual's right to legally possess guns and properly store them. Mine were legally purchased and properly stored.
Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't encourage people to feel that they have to arm themselves to defend their own homes?
I certainly hope. And you know, one of the things that happened in the pandemic, not just in Los Angeles, but all across the country, was an increase in gun purchasing. Yeah. One of the reasons why we've had an increase in crime in Los Angeles is because of ghost guns. And ghost guns absolutely need to be cracked down on. And that's something that will be a focus of mine as well.
What is the long-term solution to the homelessness and housing crisis? Because housing affordability is pretty big problem in Los Angeles.
Absolutely right. Los Angeles has become unaffordable. You have to have a comprehensive approach. There's no magic bullet. So first and foremost, you have to prevent people from falling into homelessness, and clearly affordability is key to that. But you know, people are on the streets for a variety of issues, and you have to address why they're there. Is it substance abuse? Is it mental illness? Is it just straight up affordability? We have people who are intense who actually work full time. We have thousands of children who are intense, some with mothers who fled domestic violence, some who are teenagers who aged out of foster care, some people who were formerly incarcerated because they are not able to find housing are intense. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a comprehensive approach and address the reasons why people were unhoused. But first and foremost, we have to get people off the streets. People are literally dying on the streets in Los Angeles, and this has got to stop.
Well, we will be watching, Mayor-elect, how you do just that. It's a tall order. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we will be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.